3 weeks ago, the woman who helped destroy my wedding walked into my company and asked me to save the business she owned with the man who was supposed to marry me. My younger sister Claire sat across from my desk and told me that her family was 6 weeks away from losing everything. Then she looked me in the eyes and said the words my mother had used to silence me for 10 years. Family comes first, Nora. What Claire didn't know was that I had spent those same 10 years keeping something she thought I would never have. Folder. Inside it were the receipts, the messages, and the proof of what really happened the night I discovered that my fiancé and my sister had already decided my wedding was never going to happen. Claire thought I had walked away because I was heartbroken. She had no idea why I had kept the evidence. And she certainly wasn't prepared for what happened when I finally opened that folder in front of her. My name is Eleanor Vance. Everyone calls me Nora. I am 45 years old, and 3 weeks ago my younger sister sat down across from my desk, in the office I built, and asked me to save the business that belongs to the man she married. The man who was supposed to marry me. She had no idea what I was holding. She still doesn't, not fully, even now. 10 years ago, I found something on his phone the night before a cake tasting, and instead of screaming about it, I made a folder. I labeled it, I dated it, and I put it in a drawer, and I never told a single person in my family what was in it. My sister thinks I walked away from our wedding because I was too proud to forgive her. She has believed that for a decade. She was about to find out how wrong she was. If any part of this sounds familiar to you, if you've ever been the one who kept the receipts while everyone else got to keep the story, stay with me, because I want you to hear all of it in order, the same way I finally laid it out for her. And if you do, I'd ask you to like this video and subscribe, but only if it earns it, only if this actually feels like your story too. These videos find the people who need them because someone else passes them along. So if someone in your life ever asked you to forgive them before they'd even finished explaining what they did, tell me about it in the comments. I read everyone, even the long ones, especially the long ones. Let me take you back to where this actually started because the office and the folder don't mean anything without Millbrook first. Millbrook, Ohio has about 6,400 people in it, one stoplight that actually matters, and a hardware store on Route 9 that my father ran for 27 years. Vance Hardware and Supply, green awning, bell over the door that never stopped sounding a half-second too late, same green apron every day, same register drawer that stuck if you didn't lift it just right, same regulars who came in for a box of nails and stayed 40 minutes to talk about nothing. My father was a quiet, steady man who believed that showing up on time was most of what love required, and he lived by that in every way that could be measured with a clock, and none of the ways that couldn't. My mother, Linda, believed something different. She believed that how a family looked mattered almost as much as how it actually was, and in a town the size of Millbrook, looking right meant a great deal. She sat on the church flower committee for 11 years. She kept a guest book by the front door for visitors to sign, as if we ran a bed and breakfast instead of a house with 2 kids in it. I was the older one. Claire came 4 years after me, and from the time she could talk, she had a gift for being easy to love in the effortless way some people just are. She was funny at dinner, the kind of funny that made adults laugh loud enough to slap the table. She cried at the right moments and laughed at the right moments and never once got sent to her room because she never did anything that required it or she never got caught, which in our house amounted to the same thing. I was the one who got good grades and set the table without being asked and stayed up late finishing Claire's book report the year she had the flu because my mother said it would be a shame for her grade to suffer over something so small. I was told, more than once, that I was the responsible one, which I understand now was never entirely a compliment. It meant I didn't need managing. It meant whatever I wanted could wait, because I could be trusted to wait for it indefinitely if necessary. The one person in that town who never once made me feel like an afterthought was my mother's older sister, my Aunt Diane. She taught 4th grade in Fairview for 31 years and never had children of her own, and somewhere around the time I turned 9 she just quietly became the adult who noticed me. She called every Sunday at 6 in the evening, not 5, not 7, 6, for reasons she never explained and I never asked about. When I made the county spelling bee finals and my parents couldn't get off work, Diane drove 40 minutes each way to sit in a folding chair and mouth the words at me from the 3rd row. I didn't win. I went out on bureaucracy, which I still remember, and she took me to get milkshakes anyway and told me that losing gracefully was a skill most adults never learned, and I should be glad I was getting the practice young. She kept every school photo I ever gave her taped inside her kitchen cabinet door, where she'd see them every time she reached for a coffee mug. I didn't know that until I was 22 years old and helping her repaint that kitchen. I cried in her pantry for 10 minutes and she let me, and never once brought it up again. There's another memory of Diane I come back to often, from the winter I was 14, when I didn't make the district honor choir and came home convinced my whole life had ended over it. My mother's response was to remind me that Claire had made honor choir the year before without half the practicing I'd done, as if that were meant to comfort me somehow. Diane, when she heard, drove over that same evening with a store-bought pie, sat on the edge of my bed, and told me that the choir director had once cut her from a community theater production for, in her words, having a voice like a rusty gate, and that she'd gone on to live a perfectly full life anyway, rusty gate and all. I still don't know if that story was true. I've never asked her because it doesn't matter whether it was. What mattered was that she showed up with a pie on a Tuesday for something nobody else in the house thought was worth showing up for. I met Daniel Pierce when I was 26, at an actuarial conference in Columbus that neither of us particularly wanted to be at. He worked in manufacturing operations, not finance, but a friend had dragged him along, and he spent most of the opening reception standing near the shrimp cocktail looking like he'd rather be anywhere else, which I found more charming than I probably should have. He was funny in a dry, understated way. He remembered small details about people, birthdays, coffee orders, the names of coworkers' dogs, and I mistook that for depth for longer than I'd like to admit. We dated for 3 years before he proposed at Diane's house, of all places, on her back porch, in October, because I'd told him once that it was the only place that had ever felt entirely safe to me. Diane baked a cake for the occasion without being asked. She still had the recipe card taped inside that same cabinet, next to the school photos. Claire had asked to be my maid of honor the day after Daniel proposed, practically before I'd finished telling her the news, and I remember being genuinely touched by it because we hadn't been especially close as adults, the way sisters 4 years apart sometimes drift once one of them leaves for college and never quite lives in the same city again. She threw herself into the planning that spring with an energy that struck me at the time as generous. She drove up to Cleveland twice to help me look at dresses. She sat through an entire Saturday of tasting menus with me and Daniel both, laughing at his jokes, taking notes on her phone about which vendors we liked best. I didn't know yet, of course, that some of those notes had nothing to do with vendors at all. Looking back now, there's a particular Saturday in June I keep returning to. The three of us at a long table at that same bakery in Dublin, months before the cake tasting that never happened. Claire sitting close enough to Daniel that their shoulders touched every time she leaned in to see the sample plate, and me too happy that day to notice it meant anything at all. My mother threw herself into the wedding the way she threw herself into anything that other people in Millbrook would see. She wanted 300 guests. I wanted 80. We landed somewhere in between, at a venue outside Columbus called the Ashworth Barn, chosen mostly because it photographed well, and I paid the deposit myself, $4,175, because Daniel and I had agreed early on that we'd split things, and I made more that year in bonus alone than he made in salary. I remember the number because I remember all the numbers. That's not a metaphor I'm reaching for later in this story. It's just how my brain has always worked, long before it became useful for anything other than annoying people at dinner parties. We had a cake tasting scheduled for that Saturday, at a bakery in Dublin, Ohio that Daniel had picked out himself because his grandmother used to buy bread there when he was a kid. I remember I'd spent that whole week trying to decide between almond and lemon filling, which sounds absurd to say out loud now given everything that came after, but I want you to understand how ordinary that Tuesday was supposed to be. We'd eaten dinner an hour earlier, pasta, nothing special. Daniel had gone to take a shower. I was rinsing plates at the sink, half listening to the news, thinking about almond versus lemon, when his phone lit up on the counter behind me. The end of my old life started on a Tuesday in September, 3 months before the wedding, at 9:47 in the evening. I know the time because Daniel's phone was on the kitchen counter, charging, face up, and a text came through from a contact saved simply as CC. I wasn't looking for anything. I'd never once looked through his phone in 3 years together. But the message was sitting right there on the lock screen, glowing, and it said, "Don't let her see the florist invoice yet. Wait till after the venue deposit's non-refundable. She'll be too far in to back out clean." I stood in that kitchen for a long time. Long enough that the screen went dark twice before I picked it up. And because he hadn't set a passcode in 3 years of dating, it opened right into a thread with C that went back 4 months, 160-some messages deep. I'm not going to read you all of them because some of it doesn't belong in anyone's mouth but theirs, but I want you to understand the tone because the tone is the part that stayed with me longer than the content did. It wasn't full of guilt. It read like two people managing a project together. There was logistics in it, calendars, timing. There was a line from Claire that said she'd talked to Mom, and Mom said as long as it happens after the wedding gets called off and not before, it'll blow over faster. People forget faster when there's no canceled wedding to gossip about. There was a line from Daniel about the ring, whether he should get it appraised before or after, in case it needed to go back to the jeweler. There was a line, 3 weeks old by that point, where Claire had typed, "She still thinks it's just cold feet on my end, she has no idea," and Daniel had responded with a single word. I didn't cry that night. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think people expect the crying to come first, and for me it came much later, in pieces, over about 18 months, usually at inconvenient times, in grocery store parking lots and once during a fire drill at work. What I did that night, standing in my own kitchen in bare feet at 10 in the evening, was screenshot every message, forward all of it to a personal email account Daniel didn't know I had, and then quietly go through the apartment, photographing the venue deposit receipt, the invitation invoice, the catering deposit slip, the alteration receipt for a dress I would never wear. $11,340, all told, that I had personally paid toward a wedding that at least two of the people closest to me already knew, weeks in advance, was never going to happen. I want to explain why I did it that way, methodically, quietly, instead of waking Daniel up out of the shower and screaming at him the way I think most people would expect. Part of it was shock, certainly, but part of it, if I'm being honest with myself even now, was that some instinct I couldn't name yet already understood that the version of this story other people would eventually hear was going to depend entirely on what I could prove. I had grown up in a house where the person who controlled the story controlled the outcome, where my mother's version of events always somehow became the official one by the time it reached the extended family. I think some quiet, calculating part of me, even at 10 at night in bare feet, already knew I was going to need my own version, in writing, dated, before anyone else got the chance to write theirs first. I put all of it in a plain manila folder from the hall closet. I wrote one word on the tab in permanent marker. Wedding. I dated it September the 14th, and then I drove to Aunt Diane's at 11 o'clock at night, and I sat on her porch steps, the same steps Daniel had proposed on, and told her everything. She didn't say a single word about family or forgiveness or moving past it. She made tea that neither of us drank and sat next to me until it got light out, and somewhere around 3 in the morning she said the only thing she said all night that I've never forgotten. "You don't owe anybody a performance of being okay. Not tonight, and not for however long it takes." My mother's version, when I finally told my parents 2 days later, sitting at their kitchen table under a light fixture that had buzzed my whole childhood, was different from what you might expect. She didn't defend Claire outright. She was smarter than that. What she said, hands folded like she was in a pew, was, "Nora, I need you to think very carefully about what tearing this family apart is going to cost everyone. Family comes first. It always has to. You can be angry and still choose family." She said it like it was wisdom handed down from somewhere holier than her own kitchen, like it wasn't, in practical terms, a request that I absorb the entire cost of what had happened quietly so the rest of them wouldn't have to feel any of it. I asked her, directly, whether she'd known before I found out myself. There was a pause. 4 seconds, maybe 5. "That's not the point," she said, which is its own kind of answer if you listen for it. "It's exactly the point," I said. "Either you knew, and you let me pay a caterer for a wedding you knew wasn't happening, or you didn't know, and you're defending Claire anyway without asking her a single question. Which one is it, Mom?" She didn't answer that directly either. What she said instead was that I'd always been the sensitive one, that I'd always taken things harder than they needed to be taken, that Claire had made a mistake with her heart, and mistakes of the heart were different from other kinds. I asked her if she'd say the same thing if the situation were reversed, if it had been my fiancé and her favorite daughter's wedding on the line instead. She looked at me like I'd said something unkind for asking. My father didn't say much of anything at all that night. He looked at the table, at his own hands, and said only that he was sorry I was hurting, not that he was sorry it had happened, and not one word to his younger daughter about what she'd done. That silence is its own kind of answer too, and I filed it away along with everything else, though it would take years before I understood what to do with it. I called off the wedding myself, by phone, in one sentence, and I never spoke to Daniel Pierce again after that call. I moved out of the apartment we shared within the week into Diane's guest room, and I did not go home for Christmas that year, or the next one, or the one after that. My mother called it punishing the family for one mistake, as though what had happened were a single stumble instead of a 4-month operation with a timeline and a budget. She never once, in 10 years, asked me what was actually in that folder. She assumed she already knew the shape of it. She was wrong about the shape, and she was badly wrong about the size. Before I take you further into this, let me pause here for a second, because I know some of you are already picturing your own version of that kitchen table. If someone in your life ever used a phrase like "family comes first" as a way of asking you to carry a weight that wasn't yours to carry, I'd genuinely like to hear about it in the comments below, whatever your version of that phrase was. And if this story is landing the way I think it might be, Go ahead and hit subscribe now, because the next part of what I'm about to tell you is the part I've never told anyone outside of Diane and my husband, not even my own father, not until 3 weeks ago. I left Millbrook 11 months later with 2 suitcases, the wedding file, and about $6,000 in savings. I want to be honest about the years that followed, because they were not glamorous, and this is not a story about revenge fantasies coming true overnight in some tidy montage. I was an actuary by training, which meant I spent my 20s reading risk the way other people read weather, and for the first 2 years after I left, I mostly just worked, went to Diane's for Sunday dinner once a month, and kept the folder locked in a drawer I didn't open. Year 1 was the hardest, if I'm ranking them, though every year had its own particular weight to carry. I sent my parents a birthday card that January, out of some stubborn habit I couldn't quite kill yet. Nobody sent one back. Diane called every single Sunday at 6 without fail, the way she always had since I was 9 years old, and some weeks that phone call was the only voice from anywhere close to home that I heard all month. I ate a lot of cereal for dinner that year. I'm not proud of it. It's just true. Somewhere near the end of year 1, an aunt on my father's side, not Diane, a different aunt I barely knew, sent me a long message online urging me to reconsider my silence toward the family, closing it with the line, almost verbatim, "Family comes first, Nora, it always has. Don't let one bad season cost you a lifetime." I read it standing in my apartment kitchen and didn't respond. I saved it instead, in a different folder, one I hadn't quite admitted to myself yet that I was building. Year 2, Claire got engaged to Daniel. I found out from a mutual cousin's social media post, not from either of them directly, and not from my parents, who I can only assume decided the news would land better secondhand. There was a photograph of the ring. I recognized it immediately, the exact stone, the exact setting. It was the appraised one. Year 3, I got promoted into a role modeling risk specifically for mid-cap manufacturing clients, which meant I spent that whole year learning the guts of how small industrial companies actually survive or fail, which supplier contracts protect a business, and which ones quietly bleed it dry from the inside. I sat in on client visits to factory floors across 3 states that year, watching plant managers walk investors through equipment they were both proud of and terrified of losing, and I started to understand, in a way textbooks never quite got across, that a business is mostly just a family's whole identity, wearing a different name on the sign out front, for better and for worse. I didn't know yet that this particular expertise would matter later, in a room I couldn't have pictured at the time, across a table from my own sister. I just knew I was good at it, and being good at something that had absolutely nothing to do with my family felt, for the first time in years, like solid ground under my feet. Year 4, Claire and Daniel married in a ceremony at the same venue I'd put a deposit down on, though I only learned that detail secondhand, years afterward, from someone who'd assumed I already knew and would find it funny by then. I did not find it funny. I filed it away, the same as everything else. Around that same time, Diane started a new habit, sending me a single photograph every week, nothing dramatic, a sunset, her garden, a bad haircut she got at the salon in town, just proof of an ordinary life continuing, addressed to nobody in particular except me. I kept every one of them in a separate album on my phone, and by the time I sat down to write out this story for you, that album had grown to just over 300 photographs, 300 small, unremarkable Tuesdays that added up, without either of us planning it that way, to a decade of somebody simply refusing to let me disappear from her life the way I'd disappeared from everyone else's. That same year, a woman I'd gone to high school with, someone I hadn't spoken to in a decade, sent me a message online asking if I was doing okay, because she'd heard things didn't work out with Daniel and wanted to check in. I never found out exactly what version of the story had reached her, but I could guess, given that it came with a small string of heart emojis and the phrase, "You'll find someone even better," as though I'd simply misplaced a fiancé the way you misplace an umbrella. I didn't correct her. I've never corrected anyone in Millbrook about any of it, not once in 10 years, because I decided early on that my silence wasn't going to be the thing that protected them anymore, but it also wasn't going to be a weapon either. I just let people believe whatever made sense to them and kept building. Let me pause again for a second, because I think this next part matters. If you've ever let people believe an easier, wrong version of your own story, just to avoid explaining the real one over and over, I understand that completely, and I'd like to know in the comments how long you carried that version around before you finally got to correct it, if you ever have yet. Hit subscribe if any of this is resonating, but only if it actually is. Year 5, my father called me for the first time in 4 years on a random Tuesday afternoon and asked how I was doing. He didn't apologize. He didn't mention Claire or Daniel at all. He just asked about my job and told me the hardware store had gotten new flooring, gray composite instead of the old wood that always smelled like linseed oil, and we talked for 11 minutes, and then he said he had to go help a customer, and that was the whole call. It wasn't much. But it was the first crack in 10 years of silence from that side of the family, and I noticed it the way you noticed the first day it doesn't hurt to breathe after a bad cold. Real. I didn't tell Diane about it for almost a month because I wasn't sure yet what to make of it myself. Year 6, using savings, a modest inheritance Diane had quietly split between herself and me from her mother's estate, and a business loan I qualified for on the strength of 6 years of spotless underwriting work, I bought a controlling stake in a struggling precision components manufacturer outside Akron. 41 employees, aging equipment, a client list slowly abandoning them for cheaper overseas suppliers who couldn't hold their tolerances but could beat their price by 20%. I named the company Holt Precision, after Diane's maiden name, without telling her first. When I finally did tell her, over the phone on a Sunday at 6, she was quiet for 11 seconds. I counted. The way I count most things. Then she said, "Well, don't you dare let it lose money. I have a reputation to protect now." And I could hear, underneath the joke, that she was crying while she said it. Those first 18 months of owning the place were nothing like the annual reports made them look later on. I learned how to run a factory floor from the ground up, mostly by asking the machinists more questions than any owner they'd worked for before had ever bothered to ask, and by staying past midnight more than once with a spreadsheet open, trying to figure out why a batch had come back out of tolerance. I lost an account in month 4 that I still think about, a small one, but it stung, because it was the first time in years I'd failed publicly at something and had nobody at a kitchen table telling me it would blow over. I had to tell myself that. I got better at it with practice. Year 7 changed the whole trajectory of the company, and honestly, of my entire life. We landed a contract with a defense subcontractor that needed tighter tolerances than most of our competitors could hold. And within 18 months, Holt Precision went from 41 employees to 130. I married Marcus that same year, a structural engineer I'd met through a supplier relationship of all unromantic ways to meet someone, in a small ceremony with 19 guests, none of whom shared my last name by blood except Diane. My mother was not invited. I sent an announcement afterward out of some instinct I still don't fully understand even now, and received no response of any kind. The wedding itself was small enough that we held it in Diane's backyard, the same yard with the same porch, and Marcus wore his grandfather's watch, and I wore my grandmother's earrings, and Ruth cried through the entire 10-minute ceremony while pretending she wasn't. At the small dinner afterward, Diane stood up with a glass of lemonade, because none of us were big drinkers, and said that she'd watched me build a life twice now, once out of nothing after everything fell apart, and once out of love with a man who actually deserved it, and that she was prouder of the second one, because the first one had cost me so much more to build. I think about that toast often, more than almost anything else from that whole year. Year 8, Marcus's mother Ruth, who lived 2 streets from us in Akron, started showing up for Sunday dinner the way Diane always had for phone calls, and between the two of them I had, for the first time since I was a girl, more mothering in my life than I quite knew what to do with. Ruth taught me to make her pierogi from scratch. Badly at first, dough tearing every time, and she kept coming back every single week to fix my technique until I finally got it right, which took 9 attempts by her count and mine both. She never once asked me a single question about the family I'd left behind. She just showed up, every week, with flour on her hands. It was also that year that I ran into a woman from Millbrook at an industry trade show in Chicago, a former classmate of Claire's who now worked in procurement for an unrelated company entirely. She recognized my name tag before she recognized my face, and over an awkward 30 seconds of small talk near a coffee station, she mentioned, almost in passing, that Claire and Daniel had bought a house on the good side of town, the side with the 2-car garages and the sidewalks that actually got shoveled in winter. I said something non-committal and excused myself shortly after, and I remember standing in a hotel hallway afterward doing quiet, useless math in my head, the kind that measures another person's life against your own, for no reason except that old habits die slowly. I didn't tell Marcus about that conversation for almost a week. I'm not entirely sure why, except that some part of me was still, even by year 8, checking whether it still hurt as much as it used to. It didn't, not the way it once had, but it wasn't nothing either. Year 9, the binder I kept tracking Holt Precision's growth had gone from a single spreadsheet on my laptop to a full annual report we sent to investors, glossy cover and everything. 40 pages of charts I'd once have needed a calculator and an evening to build and could now generate before lunch. That same year, Diane retired from teaching after 39 years total between Fairview and 2 other districts, and I flew her and Ruth both out to Charleston for a long weekend to celebrate. Just the three of us, no agenda except good seafood and a lot of walking. On the second night, sitting on a hotel balcony, Diane told me she was proud of me in a voice that cracked a little in the middle of the sentence, and I realized it was the first time anyone had said those exact words to me since I was a child, winning that spelling bee round on words I could actually spell. She'd said it plenty of times over the years in other forms, in lemon bars and Sunday calls and 11 counted seconds of silence on the phone, but never in that exact sentence, and hearing it said plainly like that undid me a little, in the good way. It was later that same year, back home, that a supplier relations manager mentioned to me, almost as an aside during a routine vendor call, that a mid-sized fabrication outfit near Millbrook called Pierce Fabrication Group had been trying to get financing to modernize its equipment and kept getting turned down by 3 different banks. I recognized the name immediately, of course. I said nothing out loud. I filed it, the way I file most things, and went back to the numbers already open on my screen, though I'll admit I sat with that particular piece of information a little longer than most. Year 10, this year, is when the family finally found out what had actually happened to me over the last decade, and true to form, they did not find out from me. It came through a Chamber of Commerce dinner in Dayton, of all unlikely places, where a Millbrook contractor who'd once bought lumber from my father recognized my name on a keynote speaker list and mentioned it weeks later to someone who still went to my mother's church. Word travels slowly through small towns and then, all at once, the way water moves through a pipe with a slow leak until suddenly it isn't slow anymore. Within a month, my mother knew I owned a 130-person manufacturing company outside Akron. Within 6 weeks, so did Claire, and so, presumably, did Daniel. I didn't hear from either of them directly, not at first. What I got instead was the foreword. Before I tell you what was in it, let me just say, if you've ever had a family member find out you were doing well through a chain of secondhand gossip instead of a phone call, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching this from tonight and what time it is where you are. I always like knowing how far these stories travel. A colleague of mine on the supplier relations side had a contact at Pierce Fabrication, a plant floor manager named Greg who occasionally traded shop talk with our own floor supervisor over coffee at industry meetups. In late spring, Greg forwarded my supervisor a screenshot, half as a joke, half as a warning between people who'd worked the floor together for years, of an internal email chain at Pierce that had apparently gone out to more people on the distribution list than intended. The subject line was, "Approach Plan, Vance Contact." I want to be careful here because I'm relaying this from memory of what was shown to me on a phone screen in my own conference room, but the substance was not subtle in the slightest. It read, in part, in Daniel's own writing style, which I recognize instantly after 10 years. She's a numbers person, don't lead with the family angle, lead with the deal, then work the family angle in after she's already engaged. Claire should be the one to go, not me. Better optics given the history. Make a list. Be specific about the ask. Don't let her think we're just here for money, even though we are. I want to tell you honestly what those 3 days actually looked like, because I think it's easy, telling a story after the fact, to make yourself sound calmer in the moment than you actually were. I didn't sleep well the first night. I found myself, more than once, standing in front of the locked drawer where the wedding file lived, not opening it, just standing there, the way you might stand in front of a door you already know what's behind. The second day, I canceled 2 meetings I never cancel, told Priya I had a migraine, which wasn't entirely a lie. It was on the third night, after Marcus had gone up to bed and I was still sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop open to that forwarded email, that something in me finally settled into something closer to resolve than to anger. I remember thinking, almost clinically, that this was simply new information, the same as any other new information that changes a risk model, and that my job now was to decide what to do with it, not to feel any particular way about having it. I sat with that email for 3 full days before I did anything at all with it. I didn't call a lawyer, because there was nothing illegal about it, just something ugly, the kind of ugly that confirms a thing you already suspected but had, some small and frankly exhausted part of you hoped you were wrong about. What I did instead, on the third night, was take the wedding file out of the drawer where it had lived for 10 years and finally add the printed email chain to it, a new page behind 14 old ones, and call Marcus into the kitchen to read all of it, start to finish, for the very first time. He'd known the outline for years, the shape of it, the dates in broad strokes, but he'd never once asked to see the folder itself, out of a kind of respect I've never quite gotten over. He'd never seen the receipts themselves, the actual numbers in my handwriting, the screenshots with their timestamps still visible in the corner of each one. He sat at that kitchen table for almost 20 minutes reading through all 15 pages, in order, slowly, the way you'd read something you understood mattered too much to skim. He didn't say much when he finished reading. He just put his hand flat on the folder, the way you put a hand on someone's shoulder, and said, "Whatever they ask you for, you don't owe them a version of yourself that makes any of this easier on them." Before I agreed to see her at all, I called our corporate counsel, a woman named Farah who has handled Holt Precision's contracts since year 7, and asked her a single question: if Pierce Fabrication came asking for credit, was there any way for this to become a legal or financial liability for the company rather than just a personal one for me? She walked me through it in about 20 minutes, calm and precise the way she always is, and confirmed what I already suspected, that as long as I treated any request through the same underwriting process every other account went through, with the same collateral requirements and the same board sign-off, there was no exposure at all, personal or corporate. I wasn't calling her to build a case against my sister. I was calling her to make sure that whatever happened in that room, my company would be protected regardless of what my heart decided to do. That distinction mattered to me. It still does. 3 weeks later, my assistant, a sharp, unflappable woman named Priya, who has worked for me for 6 years and has never once asked me a personal question she wasn't entitled to an answer to, told me a Claire Pierce had called to request a meeting, no explanation given beyond wanting to discuss a business opportunity. I said yes. I picked the time. I picked the room, the small conference room with the north-facing window, not my private office, because I wanted a table between us with witnesses passing by the glass. I had waited 10 years. I could wait one more week to make sure it happened entirely on my terms. I remember exactly what that morning looked like from my side of it. I'd gotten to the plant early, walked the floor the way I do most mornings, said good morning to the second shift crew clocking out and the first shift crew clocking in, checked a tolerance report on a batch that had come back borderline the day before, and only then gone up to my office to wait. I wasn't nervous, or if I was, it didn't feel like the nervousness I remembered from 10 years earlier. It felt more like the feeling before a routine but important client presentation, the kind where you've already done all the preparation there is to do, and all that's left is to walk in and let the numbers speak for themselves. She walked into that conference room on a Thursday morning wearing a blazer that still had the crease marks from the store, the kind you buy the day before a meeting exactly like this one. She looked older than I expected, though of course we both did, 10 years being 10 years for everyone regardless of who wronged whom. For the first 11 seconds, she just stood in the doorway looking at me. I counted, out of a habit I've never managed to break. "Nora," she said finally, "you look good, really good. This place is incredible." I told her to sit down. I did not stand up to hug her, and I want to be clear that I wasn't cruel about it. I simply treated her the way I treat any vendor walking into a first meeting, which is to say, with professional attention and my focus fully on the table between us rather than on her face, or on the 10 years of history sitting in the room with us. She started, predictably, with family. She talked about how strange it felt to be back near Millbrook for the visit, how she'd thought about calling so many times over the years and never worked up the nerve, how proud everyone secretly was of what I'd built even if nobody had ever said it out loud to me directly. I let her talk. Priya had told me once that in negotiations, the person who talks first usually loses the room, and I intended to let Claire lose it comfortably before I said a word. Eventually she got to the actual ask. Pierce Fabrication was 6 weeks from defaulting on an equipment loan. Their main tooling supplier had cut them off entirely over an unpaid balance approaching $200,000. Daniel's father had put the original capital into the business 22 years earlier, and if it folded now, it would take the family name down with it in a town where that name still carried weight at the diner and the bank both. She said Holt Precision could extend them a supplier line of credit and tooling access on terms nobody else in the region would give them, because, she said, leaning forward slightly, you understand this industry, and you understand family. You're paying, right? She said at one point, not quite meeting my eyes, fidgeting with the strap of her bag in her lap. I mean, not paying, but you'll help? You have to help. Family comes first, Nora. Mom always said that. I let 4 seconds of silence sit in that room. I counted them, the way I've counted so much else over the years. Then I opened the folder. I didn't raise my voice, not once, through any of what followed. I want you to understand that clearly, because I think what unsettled her most in that room wasn't anger, it was the complete and total absence of it. Item 1, I said. September the 14th, the venue deposit at the Ashworth Barn, $4,175, paid by me 3 months before the wedding you both already knew was never going to happen. And 2, the invitation invoice, $612, also paid by me, mailed to 211 guests, 40 of whom were on your side of the family, including you. Item 3, the catering deposit, $2,800, paid in full 4 days before I found that phone on the counter. Item 4, The alteration receipt for a dress I wore exactly 0 times, $340, tailored to fit a body that would spend the next 10 years building something you'd eventually walk into asking for help. I watched the color leave her face somewhere around item 2 and never fully come back. She started to say something around item 3, some small reflexive, Nora, but I kept going, because I had waited a decade to say all of this in order and I wasn't going to let her interrupt the count halfway through. Item 5, I said. The ring. Appraised twice, once before your engagement and once after, according to a message dated 14 months before you two ever told me you were together. I don't need the appraisal number. I already know you know it. Then I read her the message, word for word, from a contact saved as C on September the 14th, 10 years and some months earlier, about the florist invoice and the non-refundable deadline. I read her the line about mom saying it would blow over faster with no canceled wedding to gossip about. I read her the line where she told Daniel I still thought it was just cold feet, and his one-word answer back. Where did you? She started, and then stopped herself, her hand pressed flat against her mouth. I found it on his phone, I said. The night before the cake tasting. I've had it for 10 years, Claire. Every message. Every receipt. Every plan the two of you and mom made to manage me, instead of just telling me the truth to my face. And 3 weeks ago, I got a copy of an email your husband's team sent about exactly how to approach me for this meeting. She's a numbers person. Lead with the deal, work the family angle in after. Don't let her think we're just here for the money, even though we are. Did you write that last line, or did Daniel? She was crying by then, not performing it, actually crying, in the way people cry when a version of events they've told themselves for a decade collapses in real time right in front of them at a conference table. I didn't know he sent that to that many people, she said. I told him to just be honest with you. Quote, I told him that. I told him it was a bad idea, she said. I told him you'd see right through it. I did, I said, in about 4 seconds. But you came anyway, I said, knowing there was a plan. You still walked in here this morning and led with family, exactly like the email said to. She didn't have an answer for that, not right away. For a moment, just a moment, something genuinely honest slipped through, something that clearly wasn't strategy at all. I've hated myself for 10 years, she said, quiet, her voice cracking on the word hated. I used to think if I just never said it out loud, to you or to anyone, it would eventually stop being true. Then, almost as quickly as it had come, she pulled it back, straightened in her chair, wiped under her eyes with 2 fingers, and added, But you left, Nora. You could have fought for him. You could have fought for us. You just left. And you let everyone believe whatever they wanted to believe about why. That's the part I want you to notice, because it's the part that told me everything I needed to know about where we actually stood. 10 years and 1 conference room later, 1 honest sentence, and then straight back to rewriting the story so that my leaving became the injury, and her staying with the man she'd taken from me simply became life going on, the way life does. I'm not paying off your husband's loan, I told her. I'm not doing this as family, because we stopped operating as family the day you decided a wedding deposit was a useful delay tactic. Holt Precision doesn't do favors. We do contracts. If Pierce Fabrication wants a supplier line of credit, it goes through underwriting like every other account we carry, on the terms every other account gets, with collateral posted like every other account has to post. That offer stands whether your last name is Pierce or not. What doesn't stand, not anymore, is you walking into my office invoking a phrase Mom used to keep me quiet for 10 years and expecting it to still work on me the way it used to. Marcus had been standing near the window the entire time, arms crossed, saying nothing at all, and Priya had come in once, briefly, to set down a pitcher of water without being asked. On her way back out, she paused at the door just long enough to catch my eye and give me a small, steady nod, the kind of nod that said, without a single word, that she had no idea what was happening in that room, but that whatever it was, she trusted I had it handled. She'd worked for me 6 years by then. She'd seen me handle vendor disputes and factory fires, literal and otherwise, and I think that nod was her own quiet reminder to me that I was still, underneath everything, just doing my job. It steadied me more than I expected it to. Claire seemed to notice Marcus for the first time when he finally stepped forward and slid a bottle of water across the table toward her without a word. She looked at him, then at me, and something in her face seemed to understand, maybe for the first time all morning, that whatever she'd imagined walking in here today, it hadn't accounted for the fact that I'd built an entire life in 10 years that had absolutely nothing to do with waiting around for an apology from her. What about Mom? She said finally, quietly, almost like she was afraid of the answer. Does she know you have all this? She will, I said, if you decide to tell her. That part isn't my job anymore. Before she stood up to go, I told her one more thing because I'd promised myself, sitting at that kitchen table with Marcus the week before, that I would say it plainly if the moment came and not just leave her to guess. I'm not closing a door forever, I said, but it doesn't open with a business ask, and it doesn't open with mom's phrase, and it doesn't open in a single meeting. If you ever want to actually talk about what happened, not manage it, not spin it, just sit with me and be honest about it the way you were honest with me for about 4 seconds today, I'll listen. But that has to come first, on its own, with nothing attached to it. Not before, and not the same morning you need something from me. She nodded, slowly, like she was hearing the shape of it for the first time. Okay, she said. It was the only word she managed before she picked up her bag. She left about 20 minutes later, without the answer she came for, but with a standard underwriting application my assistant printed for her on the way out, the exact same application any struggling manufacturer in our supplier network would receive, no better, no worse. Whether Pierce Fabrication survives the next 6 weeks is now a question for their balance sheet and their collateral, not for their family name, and not for mine either. My mother called 4 days later. I let it go to voicemail, the same way I'd let so many calls from that house go over the years. Her message was 2 sentences long. She said Claire had told her some of it, that she wished I'd come to her first before airing things out like that in front of strangers, and that family should be able to work through anything given enough time. She did not apologize, not for the wedding, not for the kitchen table, not for 10 years of a birthday card nobody answered. She has not called again since, and I haven't called her either. I don't know if that particular silence is permanent. I've mostly stopped needing to know. My father called the week after that, and this call was different from the one 5 years earlier about the new flooring at the store. He told me Claire had shown him the email chain, the whole thing, and that it made him physically sick to read it, and that he was ashamed, genuinely ashamed, that he'd sat at that kitchen table 10 years ago and said nothing at all while my mother told me to swallow the whole thing for the family's sake. I should have said something that day, he told me, his voice rougher than I remembered it. I've thought about that kitchen table more than you probably think I have, Nora. More than I've told anyone. I asked him because I finally felt like I could, why he hadn't said anything back then, not to accuse him, just because I genuinely wanted to know. He was quiet for a while before he answered. Your mother has a way of deciding how a room is going to go before anyone else gets a vote, he said. I let her decide that room too. I've regretted it every year since, and I didn't know how to say so without it sounding like I was asking you to forgive me for it, which I wasn't ready to ask yet. I told him that was, strangely, the most honest thing anyone in that house had said to me in a decade. He laughed a little, sadly, and said he supposed it had taken him long enough. I told him I appreciated hearing all of it, and that I wasn't ready for anything more than phone calls yet, maybe not for a long while, and he said that was fair, entirely fair, that he'd take whatever I was willing to give him and be grateful for it, no conditions attached. We talk most Sundays now, after Diane's call. Not instead of it, usually about nothing much, the store, the weather, a customer who reminded him of somebody. It isn't everything. It's something, and for now, something is enough. He hasn't asked once about Claire's business, and I've noticed that he hasn't, and I think that not asking is its own quiet form of respect. Last weekend, Marcus and I had Diane and Ruth over for dinner, along with my nephew, Marcus's sister's boy, who is 7 and thinks my job is boring, right up until I let him hold a titanium test coupon from the plant floor, at which point he decides on the spot that I have the best job in the world. We ate at 6:30, the way we do most Sundays. At the same scratched oak table Marcus and I bought second-hand the year we got married because we couldn't yet afford new, and have kept ever since out of a stubbornness neither of us has ever wanted to examine too closely. Diane brought the same lemon bars she's brought to every dinner at my house for 4 years running, wrapped in the same reused foil she's used since I was a teenager, and Ruth brought pierogi that no longer need any fixing at all, sealed perfectly at every edge the way mine still occasionally aren't. My father called partway through dinner, right on schedule, the way he does most Sundays now, and I stepped into the kitchen to talk to him for a few minutes while everyone else kept eating. He told me about a customer who'd come in that morning needing a very specific gauge of wire nobody stocked anymore, and how he'd spent 40 minutes on the phone tracking some down from a distributor 2 counties over, just so the man wouldn't have to drive to Columbus for it. It was such a small, ordinary story, the kind of thing he'd have told me 100 times when I was a girl behind that same register. I stood in my own kitchen, phone against my ear, and thought about how strange it was that this small, ordinary kindness from a stranger's Tuesday afternoon was the thing that finally felt like getting a piece of my father back. When I sat back down at the table, Diane asked, the way she always does, whether I wanted the last lemon bar or whether she should wrap it up for Marcus's lunch tomorrow, and I looked around at all of it, The scratched table, the foil she's reused since I was 16, my nephew narrating an entirely made-up story about the test coupon to nobody in particular, and I understood, in a way I couldn't have put into words 10 years ago sitting on her porch steps at 11 at night, that this was what the whole decade had actually been building toward the entire time. Not the company, not the folder, not even the confrontation in that conference room. This table. This particular, ordinary Sunday, and the dozens before it, and however many are still ahead. People sometimes ask me, or they ask in the comments on videos like this one, whether I regret keeping that folder for 10 years instead of confronting everyone the week it happened. I don't. I think there's a version of me in another life who screamed at that kitchen table the night I found out, who threw the receipts down in front of my mother and demanded she choose a side on the spot, and I think that version of me might have gotten an apology faster, or might have gotten nothing at all, just a louder version of the same dismissal. I chose the slower way instead, and it cost me 10 Christmases and a decade of my mother's voice on the phone, but it also gave me 10 years to build a table sturdy enough that when my sister finally sat down at it, on my terms, in my building, she couldn't rewrite a single word of what had actually happened. That trade is the one I'd make again. Every time. That's my story. 10 years, one manila folder, $11,340 I never asked anyone to pay back, and a phrase my mother used to keep me quiet that I finally got to hand back to the person who used it on me first. If you take one thing from this, let it be this. Family comes first is not a real boundary. It's usually just a request dressed up to sound like one, and you're always allowed to ask who exactly is being asked to go first and what it's actually costing them to do it. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what your own version of the phrase was. That's my story, and I'll see you in the next one.